In this video and the next couple of videos, we are going to take a look at justification, epistemic justification, the justification of beliefs. Now, why do we care about justification? Well, there are at least two reasons. The first reason is that justification seems to be an ingredient of knowledge. As we already saw in one of the previous videos, just having a true belief doesn't seem to be enough for having knowledge, right? Suppose that there's something that I believe just because I want it to be true, right? I really want it to be sunny tomorrow because I have planned a hiking trip and I believe that it will be sunny tomorrow. Not because I've checked out the weather forecast or anything like that, but just because I want it to be true. Now, even if I'm right, even if it is going to be sunny tomorrow, that doesn't mean that I know it, right? There seems to be something lacking in my epistemic state. And what seems to be lacking is what we might call justification, right? I don't have any good reasons. So if I have a true belief, but I have it without having any good reasons for it, it would seem to fall short of knowledge. And so if we want to understand knowledge, we want to know about these good reasons, we want to know about this notion of justification, and that is one reason to care about it. Here's another reason to care about justification and to pay attention to the concept. And that is that, like, when we talk about our beliefs with each other, the question of justification just comes up a lot of the time, right? If I tell you that I believe something, you might well ask me, well, why? Right? Why do you believe that? And that why question usually is a question for justification. And you presumably expect that I have an answer to it, right? That I can give you some reasons, that I can explain to you why I believe something in a way that shows what I take the justification for this belief to be. And presumably I also believe that if I give you my justification, if I tell you why I believe it, that you maybe come to believe it as well, right? If my reasons are good reasons, or at least if I believe that they are good reasons, then I also ought to believe that they are good reasons for you, right? I mean, a good reason is just a good reason. And so justification comes up also in context of persuasion. If I try to persuade you, I'm going to give you my justification for believing something, hoping and maybe expecting that that will be a justification for you as well. So as soon as we start talking about our beliefs, comparing our beliefs, we also start justifying our beliefs, right, to each other. So it's a very good idea to take a look at justification. And what we will also see is that justification generates some really interesting philosophical puzzles that we want to know more about. Now, before I try to delve into how justification works and the kinds of puzzles that we run into, I would like to distinguish justification, this kind of epistemic justification, from two other things that you might talk about when you talk about beliefs, and which could also be answers to why questions. So suppose that you ask me, hey, Victor, you believe that this particular set of religious beliefs is the only true religion and every other religion in the world is false. Why do you believe that? And maybe I say, well, I was just raised that way. That's what my parents taught me when I was a small child. That does explain why I have these beliefs, at least to some extent, right? It tells a sort of causal story about my childhood in which I imbibed certain beliefs, and apparently I never changed them, and that's why I have these beliefs and not other beliefs, right? And it might seem that I'm suggesting that if I had been raised in a different way, I would have a different set of beliefs. So that's a kind of explanation, but it's what we might want to call a causal explanation, right? It gives you the causes why I believe something. It tells you what happened that made me believe it, but it doesn't really give any reasons. Right? I mean, the fact that I have been raised in a certain way is hardly a reason for you to believe something, but in fact it's not even really a reason for me to believe something. Right? And if this is the only thing I could say about having particular religious beliefs, it would seem a very weak story. Right? I mean, if I believe certain kind of claims about the divine or the afterlife, and the only thing I can say about them is that, well, you know, I was just raised that way, then it seems that I recognize that I don't have any very good reasons for believing it. And that might in fact almost be a reason to give up those beliefs, or at least try harder in getting to, you know, the point where I have real justification. Okay, so when we ask about epistemic justification, we do not ask about a causal history. And so we do not expect answers like, I was just raised that way, or, well, it's just a hunch that I accepted, or, you know, I was hit on the head with a hammer and afterwards I believed this stuff, or I have been manipulated by a brain scientist or something like that. And none of that would count as a justification, though it might be a causal explanation. The other type of answer to a why question that is not epistemic justification is what we might want to call a practical or pragmatic justification. Right? I mean, suppose that I believe that my favorite football club is going to win the Champions League next year. And you come to me and you say, well, they have a terrible track record. I mean, why do you believe that they are going to win the Champions League next year? And I say, you know, it makes me feel good. And that's why I believe it. Well, that's maybe some kind of justification, right? I mean, if it makes me feel good, okay, I mean, that's a reason to believe it. But it's not an epistemic reason. Right? It doesn't show me that the belief is likely to be true. It only shows me that I'm going to have certain advantages if I manage to believe it, which is going to involve some mental gymnastics, by the way. Right? If I know that I believe something just to feel good, do I really believe it? Can I really believe it? We get into a little bit, you know, the same situation that we get in when we can only give a causal explanation. Right? If I know that I only believe something because that's how I've been raised and there are no arguments, can I still really believe it? If I know that I only believe something because it makes me feel good or it gives me some other advantage, can I really believe it? So the interesting thing about epistemic justification here is that it seems to be the only thing that makes sort of belief really possible in a sort of, well, self-consistent and coherent way, right? If I have reasons for believing something, if I think it's likely to be true and I can explain to myself why I think it's likely to be true, okay, that is believing something, right? Believing something is believing that it's likely to be true. It is believing that you have reasons to believe it's likely to be true. More or less. So maybe we can have beliefs where we know that we don't have justification, right? I think that it probably happens, and my examples were not like too far-fetched, but it's a strange, almost paradoxical situation to be in. So that's something we might want to keep in mind. Having said that, I am now, in this video and the next videos, going to focus purely on epistemic justification, on giving good reasons that are supposed to show that the belief is likely to be true. Okay, so how does justification work? Well, I think the most obvious way of thinking about justification is, you know, somebody asks you, well, why do you believe this? And then you give some reasons. And those reasons are further beliefs which allow you to maybe deduce the belief that you're trying to justify, or allow you to at least show that the belief you want to justify is likely, something like that. So what you're doing is you're giving a kind of argument, right? There are certain premises, other things that you believe, and there's a certain inferential structure. Maybe it's a deductive argument, maybe it's an inductive argument, but there's some kind of inference going on, some kind of reasoning going on, and the belief that you're trying to justify is the conclusion. So, if you ask me the following thing, right? I mean, here's something I never really thought about maybe. Are there more than 1,000 dogs in the Netherlands? Are there more than 1,000 dogs in the Netherlands? Yeah, you know, yes, there are more than 1,000 dogs in the Netherlands. I believe that. And now you ask me, well, why do you believe it? And I say, well, you know, a fair number of people have dogs. Let's say, I don't know, but certainly more than 1% of the population has dogs. Certainly more than 1% of the population has dogs. And like 17 million people live in the Netherlands. Right? So if 17 million people live in the Netherlands and more than 1% of the population has dogs, oh, you know, that's already 170,000 dogs. So even if I'm wrong by a factor of 10, I mean, there's still 17,000 dogs, which is way more than 1,000. So clearly there are more than 1,000 dogs in the Netherlands. That seems pretty fine, right, as far as justification goes. And what I've done is I've given you some other things I believe. Right, I've told you that more than 1% of the people own a dog. I've told you that there are 17 million people in this country. I put it together in a sort of mathematical argument, and it shows that, you know, there are way more than 1,000 dogs in the country. Okay, you know, that seems to work. That seems fine. And so one way to think about justification is to think that it works through inference. Right? I am justified in believing something if maybe if I have inferred it, if I have argued towards it from premises that I also believe, right? That could be a sort of a first attempt at defining justification. I am justified in believing something if I have inferred it from other things I believe. Well, there are a couple of problems with that. The first problem that I want to focus on is that, you know, we seem to believe a lot of things that maybe we haven't really inferred, right? So, for instance, just to take the same example, I mean, I believe that there are at least 1,000 dogs in the Netherlands before I thought up this particular inference. So it turned out that I could justify my belief by giving an inference, but I don't know whether I sort of really had that inference before I had the belief. Right? So maybe we should weaken our conditions a little bit, right? Maybe we should say something like, well, a belief is justified if you can infer it from other things you believe. Or maybe a belief is justified if you sort of unconsciously inferred it from other beliefs, right? Something like that. And it's going to be tricky to make this really precise. It's going to be tricky because what exactly does it mean that you could have inferred it? You know, I mean, should it be easy for me? Should it be a type of inference that I do regularly? Is it okay if I could infer it like using some expert who can help me think through the reasons? But also, what if I mean, it seems that some kind of inference maybe already has to have taken place if I am to sort of believe something justifiably. Right? I mean, suppose that by a complete hunch, like randomly, I think, oh, there must be at least 1,000 dogs in the country. And only then do I start thinking about, you know, why could that be true? Right? Am I already justified, right, when I have the hunch? Or am I only justified when I have really sort of done the reasoning? I mean, these are hard questions. We're not going to try to delve into them here, but it's good to know that they are on the table. Right? How exactly does this inference work? Do you already have to do it? Does it have to happen consciously, or is it okay if it sort of happens unconsciously? Or maybe it's good enough if you have a sort of vague hunch about how to do the inference, and then you can work out the details later. You know, lots of questions to be asked there. So that's the first thing the first problem I wanted to notice. The second problem for the claim that to justify something is to infer it from other things you believe, is that, you know, those other things you believe probably need to be justified as well. Right? Suppose that I say, well, you know, I believe that the moon is made of green cheese. And you say, well, why do you believe that? And I say, well, I believe that the moon is made of green cheese because Isaac Newton said that the moon is made of green cheese, and Isaac Newton was a really smart astronomer. And so I use that, right? I believe those things, and I use that to infer that the moon is made of green cheese. Am I justified in believing that the moon is made of green cheese? Well, why do I believe that Newton said this? I mean, that's weird. I mean, of course, Newton didn't say that. It seems that you need to ask me a further question, right? You need to ask me, well, why do you believe that Newton said that? right? And then we have to sort of find a string of maybe reasons. We have to know that the premises that I'm using are themselves justified, right? If I believe things in a completely unjustified manner, and then from that I deduce other things, then those other things are not automatically justified, right? I mean, you can't build justification on top of something that is itself not justified. So maybe we should change our definition of justification a little bit more, right? Maybe we should say that I am justified in believing something if I can infer it, not have inferred it, but can infer it from other beliefs that I have that are also justified. Right? And again, there's going to be a lot of subtleties, but this is at least a step in the right direction. Right? I am justified in believing something if I can or could infer it from other things I believe that are also justified, that I'm also justified in believing. So that's a step in the right direction. And that's where I'm going to sort of leave this attempt at analysis. But now, this attempt at analysis, and especially the last part where we said that a justified belief has to be based on other beliefs that are also justified, is going to raise our big philosophical problem. A problem that is going to keep exercising us for the next couple of videos. And it's a problem that maybe we can call the regress problem, right? Because there is an infinite regress lurking here. If I believe something, if I'm justified in believing something only if I can infer it from something that I'm justified in believing, well, then it seems that I have to have inferred that from something else that I was justified in believing. And in order to be justified in believing that, I have to have inferred it from something else that I was justified in believing, and so on and so forth. Right? It seems that any justification is going to require a prior justification, which in turn is going to need a prior justification, which in turn is going to require a prior justification, and so on. And that seems hard, right? I mean, if I have to believe something in a justified way, I can give some reasons, but if somebody asks me why about those reasons, and I have to give more reasons, and then more reasons, and then more reasons, and then more reasons, and then more reasons, if that goes on forever, that would seem to be a pretty tough task to accomplish, right? And so we might worry that justification is a lot harder than we hoped, and maybe even impossible. Okay, well, this idea leads us into something that is sometimes called in the literature Agrippa's trilemma. And Agrippa was a Pyrrhonic skeptic in ancient times who tried to make trouble, really. He tried to make trouble for all dogmatic philosophers, for everybody who sort of claimed to believe something, by showing that if you try to give arguments for your beliefs, you're going to run into these types of regresses or circles. And so Agrippa's trilemma, as we nowadays usually call it, suggests that there are only three ways in which we could get out of this problem. And if there are only three ways in which we could get out of this problem, then hopefully one of those three is going to be good. But maybe they all seem bad, right? And if they all seem bad, then actually there's a fourth option. And the fourth option would be that there's no way out, right? And that justification just turns out to be sort of impossible. Okay, so let's set out the three, but really four ways that Agrippa's trilemma could end. Okay, so here's one option. One option is to say, yes, there is an infinite regress in justification, and that just is how justification works. Right? Whenever you believe something, you actually believe infinitely many things. And you are justified because you can build up this infinite chain of justifications. This theory is called infinitism, and it has a couple of defenders, but it's not very popular. And you can see why it's not very popular, because it's kind of hard to buy that whenever we believe something with justification, there's an infinite chain of reasoning behind that. Right? I mean, where do all those infinite beliefs come from? It's maybe not impossible, right? Maybe there is a sense in which we believe infinite things, right? Maybe it's true that I believe that 1 + 1 is 2, and 1 + 2 is 3, and 1 + 3 is 4, and I sort of believe infinite things. But it's hard to see how this would sort of work or come into practice for like the everyday beliefs that we believe are justified. Okay, so I'm going to set infinitism aside, and I'm not going to make a video about it. So here's the second option. The second option is to say, okay, look, these regresses have to stop. And they stop because at a certain point, you are going to reach beliefs that don't require further justification. So some beliefs require justification through inference, but some beliefs do not. They are just themselves justified, or they are justified like in some non-inferential way, but there's a special class of beliefs which don't need to be justified by any further beliefs. They just are justified themselves, and we need to talk about how, but that's what they are. And they are the sort of foundation on which the other beliefs are built through inference. And so this type of thinking about justification, which claims that there's a special class of beliefs that doesn't really need to be justified, or at least doesn't need to be justified through inference, which posits a kind of foundation for our other beliefs, is called foundationalism. And my next 2 videos will be about foundationalism. So that's one option. Third option is to say, look, what happens when we follow these chains of justification is that, it turns out to be one big interconnected network, right? I believe A because of B, and I believe B because of C, and I believe C because of A, right? I mean, maybe there are circles, there are cycles, or maybe it's way more complicated than that, right? It's just the case that there are lots of beliefs and they all hang together and they all sort of support and justify each other in various and very complicated ways. But that's how justification works. It's by hanging together. And yeah, I mean, there's a sort of circularity in that, right? I'm justified in believing this thing because I'm justified in believing all those other things. And I'm justified in believing all those other things in part because I'm justified in believing this thing. So there's a sort of holism in justification, right? I mean, we don't justify sort of individual elements. It's sort of the whole that hangs together, that is coherent. And because it is coherent, all the parts of it are justified. We're justified in believing them. And this kind of theory is called coherentism. So coherentism claims that justification, yeah, in a sense it can be circular. It's about the coherence of larger sets of beliefs, maybe even all our beliefs together. That's what generates justification. So these really are the 3 structures the 3 inferential structures that justification could have, right? There are infinite chains, or there are finite chains which stop at a foundation that is itself justified in a non-inferential way. Or, yeah, okay, these infinite chains are just sort of circular, and what we have is a network of beliefs that justify each other. If none of those theories work, or work well, then maybe you have to give up on justification altogether. And that would be one route towards skepticism. We're going to talk about skepticism in some later week. For now, we're going to focus on the 2 main theories about the structure of justification: foundationalism and coherentism.